Tracie Hall, welcome to 7:30.
Thank you for having me.
Could you explain for an Australian audience what has been happening to people's access to books in the United States in recent years?
Well, over the past 3 years, we have seen a startling increase in the number of books that have been challenged, banned outright, or restricted. And we know that school and public libraries, as well as state legislation to restrict access to books at school and public libraries, have been the majority of the places that we have seen this unprecedented rise and increase in censorship in modern history.
What's driven it?
Well, it's really important to speak about, because what we know is that although this is a movement that is aimed at the grassroots, it isn't coming from the grassroots. More and more we are seeing that there are a finite number of groups, a lot of them politically motivated, who are seeking to destabilize or to delegitimize voting blocs, mostly people of color, LGBTQIA, people who are interested in civil rights, and really going after the literature that represents those concerns. So more and more, as we are able to do the deep research and analysis, we see a finite number of politically motivated groups that are really, I think, flouting what the majority of people in the U.S. believe, which is that censorship is something that should not be allowed, and that it is a violation of our First Amendment rights.
Well, absolutely. I mean, free speech is enshrined in your Constitution, and the rise in censorship, where you've got all but 4 states moving in that direction towards censorship in the last few years, is extraordinary. How important has the pandemic been in sort of turbocharging it?
Yes, that's a great question and a great connection, because I think that the pandemic, at the very beginning, we saw a moratorium, we saw pushback on certain words being used. It was really hard even for public health care workers to talk about COVID-19 as a pandemic, and also to talk about disease mitigation strategies, whether that was masking or the vaccine. And so in some states, actually, there were real deep restrictions on what healthcare workers could say publicly. And what we're seeing now, of course, is that moratorium on using certain language, that pushback against talking about certain information that has always been in the public realm, has made its way to reading. So I think that the same types of moratoriums that we saw in the public health sector have now taken over and have become normalized. We have books, for instance, that are being challenged because they discuss menstruation. We have books that are being challenged because they discuss voting rights. We have books being challenged because they talk about civil rights, that they talk about women's access to the ballot. And so I think that you can make that connection and say that we're really headed in the wrong direction when it comes to free speech, and even when it comes to things like public safety and public health care.
So how does this affect public libraries in a day-to-day sense in the life of librarians? I mean, how do these bans get imposed on public libraries?
Well, I mean, we are seeing the kind of legislation in the U.S. that, unfortunately, I am noting is arising here in Australia, where if librarians collect or make available materials that might have been challenged sometimes by one person who hasn't even read the book, that if the material is found in a library, that a librarian could be charged for making that book available. We're also seeing bomb threats. Over the last year, we've had 10 verified bomb threats happen in libraries across the country. We're also seeing retaliation against librarians and library workers, people who are basically sometimes being run out of the library or even run out of town if they're seen or understood to be defending intellectual freedom, which is really the job of librarians and library workers. So we're seeing a a field that has traditionally been considered one of the most trusted. We're seeing libraries, which in the U.S. are the most visited public service institution. We're seeing both the field as well as the site challenged and threatened in a way that has never happened before.
So you've described librarians who people probably have a pretty stereotyped view of as having to become warriors in this battle.
Yes.
But it must have also had huge implications for your role as the head of the American Librarian Association. What's it meant for the way you've had to advocate on behalf of libraries and librarians?
Yes, well, when I was head of the American Library Association, I think like any librarian, I really understood access to information to be a human right. I think what the wake-up call has been is that if we don't defend the right to read, we could really see it limited and circumscribed, and we could see it go away. You know, we are in a time where some of the legislation, and you talked about the fact that 46 states have introduced some legislation to curtail the right to read, but we're also seeing legislation following that is defunding libraries, threatening to defund or close libraries. And of course, if we think about what happened in the UK after Brexit, we see that 25% of the public libraries across the UK were lost. So one of the things that I think that I understand, I think that librarians in the U.S. understand, and I know that I'm going to be speaking to those people who care about libraries here in Victoria on Thursday. One thing that we know is that if we don't exercise and protect the right to read, it could go away.
Can you give us some idea of the sorts of famous books that have been banned in the US now?
Well, the Bible, the Torah, the Quran, but also books like Harry Potter, you know, which I know has been challenged here. Books like The Bluest Eye, in addition to books like Gender Queer. The majority of books that have been banned neck and neck are books that are by and about people of color or people who are LGBTQIA or both. But closely following that are books that are about civil rights and books that are about aspects of history that we still struggle around. And so the majority, I think, of books that are being banned tend to be overwhelmingly considered to be canonical, meaning that they are considered to be some of the greatest works of literature. And that's what's so troubling, is that these great works of literature are being challenged by, and I have to say this again, people who admit that they haven't read the books. Many times they're being persuaded to challenge books. Oftentimes when we get to the source of who's asking them, we see political motivations.
Well, finally, what if books incite hatred? Is banning a book ever reasonable?
Never, never. There is something in a book for everyone, and there is somebody for every book. I don't think that there is a place to stop when we begin banning books, and so that's why we should never start. We have to believe that free people read freely and that the right to read is a human right. Everywhere that people are, everywhere that ideas are, people have the right to access those ideas. That is our human right.
Tracie D Hall, thank you so much for talking to us tonight.
And thank you for having me, Laura.